Continuation of the book on China, Chapter 1, The Singularity of China. Societies and nations tend to think of themselves as eternal. They also cherish a tale of their origin. A special feature of Chinese civilization is that it seems to have no beginning. It appears in history less as a conventional nation-state than a permanent natural phenomenon. In the tale of the Yellow Emperor, revered by many Chinese as the legendary founding ruler, China seems already to exist. When the Yellow Emperor appears in myth, Chinese civilization has fallen into chaos. Competing princes harass each other and the people, yet as enfeebled ruler fails to maintain order, levying an army, the new hero pacifies the realm and is acclaimed as emperor. The Yellow Emperor has gone down in history as a founding hero, yet in the founding myth, he is re-establishing, not creating, an empire. China predated him. It strides into the historical consciousness as an established state requiring only restoration, not creation. This paradox of Chinese history recurs with the ancient sage of Confucius. Again, he is seen as the founder of a culture, although he stressed that he had invented nothing, that he had merely tried to revigorate the principles of harmony which had once existed in the Golden Age, but had been lost in Confucius' own era of political chaos. Reflecting on the paradox of China's origins, the 19th century missionary and traveler, the Abbé Regis Evariste Hooke, observed, Chinese civilization originates in an antiquity so remote that we vainly endeavor to discover its commencement. There are no traces of the state of infancy among this people. This is a very peculiar fact respecting China. We are accustomed in the history of nations to find some well-defined point of departure, and the historical documents, traditions, and monuments that remains to us generally permit us to follow almost step by step the progress of civilization. To the present at its birth, to watch its development, its onward march, and in many cases its subsequent decay and fall. But it is not thus with the Chinese. They seem to have been always living in the same stage of advancement and as in the present day, and the data of antiquity are such as to confirm that opinion. When Chinese written characters first evolved during the Shang dynasty in the second millennium before Christ, ancient Egypt was at the height of its glory. The great city-states of classical Greece had not yet emerged, and Rome was millennia away. Yet the direct descendant of the Shang writing system is still used by well over 1 billion people today. Chinese today can understand inscriptions written in the age of Confucius. Contemporary Chinese books or conversations are enriched by centuries-old aphorisms, citing ancient battles and court intrigues. At the same time, Chinese history featured many periods of civil war, interregnum, and chaos. After each collapse, the Chinese state reconstituted itself as if by some immutable law of nature. At each stage, a new uniting figure emerged, following essentially the precedents of the Yellow Emperor, to subdue his rivals and reunifying China, and sometimes enlarge its bounds. The famous opening of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a 14th century epic novel featured by centuries of Chinese, including Mao, who is said to have pored over it almost obsessively in his youth, evokes this continuum rhythm. The empire long divided must unite, long united must divide. Thus it has ever been. Each period of disunity was viewed as an aberration Each new dynasty reached back the previous dynasty's principles of governance in order to re-establish continuity. The fundamental precepts of Chinese culture endured, tested by the strain of periodic calamity. Before the seminal event of Chinese unification in 221 before Christ, there had been a millennium of dynasty rule that gradually disintegrated as the feudal subdivisions evolved from autonomy to independence. The culmination was 2.5 centuries of turmoil, recorded in history as the Warring States period from 475 to 221 before Christ. Its European equivalent would be interregnum between the threat of Westphalia in 1648 and the end of the Second World War, when a multiplicity of European states was struggling for preeminence within the framework of the balance of power. After 221 before Christ, China maintained the idea of empire and unity, but followed the practice of fracturing, then reuniting in cycles sometimes lasting several hundred years. When the state fractured, wars between the various components were fought savagely. Mao once claimed that the population of China declined of 50 million of 10 million during the so-called Three Kingdom period, from 220 to 80 after Christ, and the conflict among the contending groups between the two world wars and the 20th century was extremely bloody as well. As its ultimate extent, the Chinese cultural sphere stretched over the continental area much larger than any European state, indeed about the size of the continental Europe. Chinese language and culture and the imperial political rite expanded to every known terrain, from the steppelands and the pine forests and the north shaping into Siberia to the tropical jungles and terraced rice farms in the south, from the east coast with its canals, ports, and fishing villages to the stark deserts of Central Asia and the ice-capped peaks of the Himalayan frontier. The extent and variety of this territory boasted the sense that China was a world into itself. It supported the conception of the emperor and a figure of universal consequences presiding over Tiansha, or all under heaven, the era of Chinese preeminence. Throughout many millennia of Chinese civilization, China was never obliged to deal with other countries or civilizations that were comparable to it in scale and sophistication. India was known to the Chinese, as Mao later noted, but for much of history it was divided into separate kingdoms. The two civilizations exchanged good and Buddhist influences along the Silk Road, but were elsewhere walled off from casual contact by the almost impenetrable Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau. The massive and forbidding deserts of Central Asia separated China from the Near Eastern cultures of Persia and Babylonia, and even more from the Roman Empire. Trade caravans undertook intermittent journeys, but China as a society did not engage societies of comparable scale and achievement. Though China and Japan shared a number of core cultural and political institutions, neither was prepared to recognize the other's superiority. Their solution was to curtail contact for centuries at a time. Europe was even further away, in what the Chinese considered the Western Oceans, by definition inaccessible to Chinese culture and pitiably incapable of acquiring it. As the emperor told to a British envoy in 1793, the territorial claims of the Chinese Empire stopped at the water's edge as early as the Song dynasty from 1960 to 1279, 1279. China led the world in nautical technology. Its fleets could have carried the empire into an era of conquest and exploration. Yet China acquired no overseas colonies and showed relatively little interest in the countries beyond its coast. It developed no rationale for venturing abroad to convert the barbarians to Confucian principles or Buddhist virtues. When the conquering Mongols commanded the Song fleet and its experienced captains, they mounted 2 attempted invasions of Japan. Both were turned back in the inclement weather, the kamikaze and the divine wind of Japanese lore. Yet, when the Mongol dynasty collapsed, the expeditions, though technically feasible, were never again attempted. No Chinese leader ever articulated a rationale for why China would want to control the Japanese archipelago, but in the early years of the Ming dynasty, between 405 and 433, China launched one of history's most remarkable and mysterious naval enterprises. Admiral Zheng He set out in fleets of technologically unparalleled treasure ships to destinations as far as Java, India, the Horn of Africa, and the Strait of Hormuz. At the time of Zheng's voyages, the European age of exploration had not yet begun. China's fleet possessed what would have seen the unbridgeable technological advantage in the size, sophistication, and number of its vessels. It dwarfed the Spanish Armada, which was still 150 years away. Historians still debate the actual purpose of these missions. Zheng He was a singular figure in the age of exploration, a Chinese Muslim eunuch conscripted into imperial service as a child. He fits no obvious historical precedent. At each stop on his journey, he formally proclaimed the magnificence of China's new emperor, bestowed lavish gifts of the rulers encountered, and invited them to travel in person on send envoy to China. There, they were to acknowledge their place in the sinocentric world ordered by performing the ritual no-tao, or to acknowledge the emperor's superiority, yet beyond declaring China's greatest and issuing invitations to portentous ritual, Zheng He displayed no territorial ambition. He brought back only gifts or tribute. He claimed no colonies or resources for China beyond the metaphysical bounty of extending the limits of all under heaven. At most, he can be said to have created favorable conditions for Chinese merchants through a kind of early exercise of Chinese soft power. Zheng He's expedition stopped abruptly in the 433, coincident with the recurrence of the drafts along China's northern land frontier. The next emperor ordered the fleet dismantled and the records of the Zheng He's voyage destroyed. The expeditions were never repeated, though Chinese traders continued to ply the routes Zheng He sailed. China's naval abilities faded, so much so that the Ming rulers' response to the subsequent menace of piracy of China's southeast coast was to attempt a forced migration of the coastal population 10 miles inland. China's naval history was thus a hinge that failed to swing. Technically capable of dominance, China retired voluntarily from the field of the naval exploration just as Western interest was beginning to take hold. China's splendid isolation nurtured a particular Chinese self-perception. Chinese elites grew accustomed to the notion that China was unique, not just a great civilization among others, but civilization itself. A British translator wrote in 1850s. An intelligent European, accustomed to reflect on the state of number of countries enjoying a variety of different advantages and laboring each under peculiar disadvantages, could, by a few well-directed questions and from very little data, form a tolerably correct notion of the state of a people hitherto unknown to him. But it would be a great error to suppose that this is the case with the Chinese. Their exclusion of foreigners and confinement to their own country has, by depriving them of all opportunities of making comparisons, sadly circumscribed their ideas, they are thus totally unable to free themselves from the domino of association and judge everything by rules of purely Chinese convention. China knew, of course, of different societies around the periphery in Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, Burma, but the Chinese perception China was considered the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, and other societies were assessed as gradations from it. As the Chinese saw it, a roast of lesser states that imbibed Chinese culture as paid tribute to China's greatness constituted the natural order of the universe. The borders between China and the surrounding people were not so much political and territorial demarcations as cultural differentiations. The outward radiance of Chinese culture throughout East Asia led the American political scientist Liu Xianpai to comment famously that in the modern age, China remains a civilization pretending to be a nation state. The pretensions underlying this traditional Chinese world order endured well into the modern era. As late as 1863, China's emperor, himself a member of the foreign Manchu dynasty that had conquered China 2 centuries earlier, dispatched a letter informing Abraham Lincoln of China's commitment to the good relations with the United States. The emperor based his communication on the grandiloquent assurance that, having with reverence received the commission of the heaven of the rule of the universe, he regarded both the Middle Empire, China, and the outside countries as constituting one family, without any distinction. When the letter was dispatched, China had already lost 2 wars with the Western powers, which were busy staking out spheres of interest in Chinese territory. The emperor seems to have treated these catastrophes as similar to other barbarian invasions that were overcome, in the end, by China's endurances and superior culture. For most of history, there was in fact nothing particularly fanciful about Chinese claims. With each generation, the Han Chinese had expanded for their original base in the Yellow River Valley, gradually drawing neighboring societies into various stages of approximation of Chinese patterns. Chinese scientific and technological achievements equaled and frequently outstripped those of their Western European, Indian, and Arab counterparts. Not only was the scale of China traditionally far beyond that of the European states in population and in territory, until the Industrial Revolution, China was far richer. United by a vast system of canals connecting the great rivers and population centers, China was for centuries the world's most productive economy and most populous trading area. But since it was largely self-sufficient, other regions had only peripheral comprehension of its vastness and its wealth. In fact, China produced a greater share of total world GDP than any Western society in 18 of the last 20 centuries. As late as 1820, it produced over 30% of the world's GDP, an amount exceeding the GDP of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the United States combined. Western observers encountering China in the early modern era were stunned by the vitality and material prosperity. Writing in 1736, the French Jesuit Jean-Baptiste Duhalde summoned up an awe-struck reactions of Western visitors to China. The riches peculiar to each province, and the facility of conveying merchandise by means of rivers and canals, have rendered the domestic trade of the empire always very flourishing. The inland trade of the empire always very flourishing, the inland trade of China is so great that the commerce of all Europe is not to be compared therewith, the provinces being like many kingdoms which communicate to each other their respective productions. 30 years later, the French political economist François Quesnay went even further. No one can deny that this state is the most beautiful in the world. the most densely populated and the most flourishing kingdom known. Such an empire as that of China is equal to what all Europe would be if the latter were united under a single sovereign. China traded with foreigners and occasionally adopted ideas and inventions from abroad, but more often the Chinese believed that the most valuable possessions and intellectual achievements were to be found within China. Trade with China was so prized that it was with only partial exaggeration that Chinese elites described it not as ordinary economic exchange, but as tribute to China's superiority. Confucianism. Almost an empire were created by force, but none can be sustainable by it. Universal rule, to last, needs to translate force into obligation, otherwise the energies of the rulers will be exhausted in maintaining their dominance at the expense of their ability to shape the future, which is the ultimate task of statesmanship. Empires persisting repression give way to consensus. So it was with China. The methods by which it was unified and periodically overturned and reunified again were occasionally brutal. Chinese history witnessed its share of sanguinary rebellions and dynasty tyrannies. Yet China owned its millennium survival far less the punishment meted out by its emperors than the community of values fostered among its population and its government of scholar officials. Not the least exceptional aspect of Chinese culture is that these values were essentially secular in nature. At the time when Buddhism appeared in Indian culture, stressing contemplation and inner peace, and monotheism was proclaimed by the Jewish and later Christian and Islamic prophets with the evocation of a life after death, China produced no religion themes in the Western sense at all. The Chinese never generated a myth of cosmic creation. Their universe was created by the Chinese themselves, whose values, even when declared of universal applicability, were conceived as Chinese in origin. The predominant values of Chinese society were derived from the prescriptions of the ancient philosopher known to posterity as Confuci or Confucius in the Latinized version. So his name was Fuzi, Confucius. Confucius lived from 551 to 471 before Christ. Lived at the end of the so-called spring and autumn period, from 770 to 476 before Christ, a time of political upheaval that led to the brutal struggles of the Warring States period, that lasted from 475 to 221 before Christ. The ruling house of Zhou was in decline, unable to exert its authority over rebellious princes competing for political power. Greed and violence went unchecked. All under heaven was again in disarray. Like Machiavelli, Confucius was an itinerant in his country, hoping to be retained as the advisor to one of the princes, then contending for survival. But unlike Machiavelli, Confucius was concerned more with the cultivation of social harmony than with the machinations of power. His themes were the principles of the compassionate rule, the performance of correct rituals, and the inculcation of filial piety. Piedade. Perhaps because he offered his prospective employers to short-term route to wealth or power. Confucius died without achieving his goal. He never found a prince to implement his maxims, and China continued its slide towards political collapse and war. But Confucius' teachings, recorded by his disciples, survived. When the bloodletting ended, and the China again stood unified, the Han dynasty from 206 to 220 after Christ adopted Confucian thought as an official state philosophy, compiled in the central collection of Confucius' sayings, the Analects, and the subsequent books of learned commentary. The Confucian canon would evolve into something akin to China's Bible, and its constitution combined. Expertise in these texts became the central qualification for service in China's imperial bureaucracy, a priesthood of literary scholar officials selected by nationwide competitive examinations and charged with maintaining harmony in the emperor's vast realms. Confucius' answer to the cause of his era was the way of the just and harmonious society which he thought had once been realized before in a distant Chinese golden age. Mankind's central spiritual task was to recreate this proper order already on the verge of being lost. Spiritual fulfillment was a task not so much of revelation of liberation, but patient recovery of forgotten principles of the self-restraint. The goal was rectification, not progress. Learning was the key to advancement in the Confucian society. Thus Confucius taught that love of kindness without a love to learn finds itself obscured by foolishness. Love of knowledge without a love to learn finds itself obscured by loose speculation. Love of honesty without a love to learn finds itself obscured by harmful candour. Love of straightforwardness without a love to learn finds itself obscured by misdirected judgment. Love of daring, without a love to learn, finds itself obscured by insubordination, and love for strength of character, without a love to learn, finds itself obscured by intractability. Confucius preached a hierarchical social creed. The fundamental duty was to know the place. To its adherents of the Confucian order offered the inspiration of service in pursuit of a greater harmony. Unlike the prophets of monotheist religions, Confucius preached to the theology of history, pointing mankind to personal redemption. His philosophy sought the redemption of the state through righteous individual behavior. Oriented toward this world, his thinking affirmed a code of social conduct, not a roadmap to the afterlife. At the pinnacle of the Chinese order stood the emperor, a figure with no parallel in the Western experience. He combined the spiritual and as well as the secular claims of social order. The Chinese emperor was both a political ruler and the metaphysical concept. In his political rule, the emperor was conceived as mankind's supreme sovereign, the emperor of humanity, standing atop a world political hierarchy that mirrored China's hierarchical Confucian social structure. Chinese protocol insisted on recognizing his overlordship via the Notao, the act of complete prostration, which the forehead touching the ground 3 times of each prostration. The emperor's second metaphysical role was this status of the Son of Heaven, the symbolic intermediary between heaven, earth, and humanity. This role also implied moral obligation on the emperor's part. Through humane conduct, performance of correct rituals, and occasional stern punishments, the emperor was perceived as the linchpin of the great harmony of all things great and small. In the emperor's trade from the path of virtue, all under heaven would fall into chaos. Even natural catastrophes we might signify that disharmony had beset the universe. The existing dynasty would be seen to have lost the mandate of heaven, by which it possessed the right to govern. Rebellions would break out, and the new dynasty would restore the great harmony of the universe. Continuo a leitura no próximo vídeo.